Good day, my friends. Let's learn something new today.
Okay, but really, have you ever looked at a bunch of data and just felt completely lost?
Oh, yeah, totally. Like trying to make sense of a spreadsheet with a million numbers.
Exactly. It's like a data blizzard hit your screen. Charts and graphs everywhere, but you can't see the forest for the trees.
Makes it tough to find those hidden patterns.
Yeah. So what if I told you there's a surprisingly simple tool that can help cut through the clutter?
Something that can help you see the signal and the noise. I'm listening.
Today's deep dive is all about the power of the dot plot.
Dot plots. I haven't thought about those since like middle school math class.
That's what I thought too. Yeah. But dot plots are way more powerful than I realized. They're not just for basic math anymore.
Really? So like how are they being used?
You can use dot plots to reveal hidden patterns in all kinds of data.
Okay, like what? Give me an example.
Well, I was reading that some epidemiologists are using dot plots to track disease outbreaks.
Wow, that's interesting. So by visualizing the data, they can see where the clusters are, right?
Yeah, exactly. And where those outliers might be popping up.
Yeah.
Or even something as simple as choosing the best coffee beans.
Okay, now you've got my attention. So like, how do they actually work? Remind me.
Yeah, it's actually pretty simple. A dot plot is a chart where each piece of data is represented by, well, you guessed it, a dot.
Okay, so far so good. Makes sense.
And these dots are placed along a number line so you can instantly see how the data is spread out.
Gotcha. So it's like instead of just seeing an average, you get to see every single data point.
Exactly. You see all the variation in the data.
Which is really important because averages can be misleading sometimes, right?
Totally. Like imagine trying to understand traffic patterns by just looking at average speeds. You'd miss those rush hour bottlenecks.
Oh, for sure. Averages just kind of smooth everything out and you miss the details.
But with a dot plot, you see all the individual slowdowns. Each car is like a dot on the chart.
So to use your traffic analogy, it's like seeing every single car on the highway instead of just the average speed. You can see where things are flowing and where things are getting backed up.
Exactly. It gives you a much richer understanding of what's going on. So we've talked about how dot plots are great for clarity, for showing detail, and for spotting outliers. Are they the perfect solution for any data visualization needs?
Well, they're definitely a powerful tool. But, I mean, no tool is perfect for every job, right?
That's what I was thinking. What are some of the limitations of dot plots?
Well, one thing to keep in mind is that dot plots work best for smaller to medium-sized data sets. They have a sweet spot.
What happens if the data set is huge?
Think of it like trying to fit 1,000 people into a phone booth.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I can imagine that would be a mess.
It gets crowded and hard to read. So for those massive data sets, you might need to use different tools.
Gotcha. So dot plots are great for exploring and understanding data, especially when you want to see every individual point. But when you're dealing with really big data, you might need to look at other visualization methods.
Right. It's all about choosing the right tool for the job.
So we know that dot plots have a sweet spot when it comes to data set size. What about the range of the data? Does that matter?
Yeah, actually it does. Dot plots can be sensitive to the range of your data.
What do you mean?
Well, if the data is spread out over a really wide range, the plot might look really sparse.
Like a bunch of dots scattered across a vast empty space.
Exactly. But if the range is really narrow, all the dots might bunch up together, making it difficult to see individual data points.
So it sounds like the data range needs to be just right for a dot plot to be effective.
Yeah, kind of like Goldilocks and the porridge. Not too wide, not too narrow, but just right.
So if the data range isn't ideal, is there anything you can do to make the dot plot work?
Oh, absolutely. There are some techniques you can use to adjust for that. Like one option is something called binning.
Binning, what's that?
It's basically where you group data points together into smaller intervals. So instead of having a dot for every single value, you might group them into ranges.
I see. So for example, if you were plotting ages, you might group people into 5-year ranges instead of showing each individual age.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that helps to create a more balanced visual representation. Another option is scaling, where you adjust the spacing on the number line to accommodate the data range.
So even if the data range is a bit tricky, you can still make a dot plot work for you.
Exactly. It's all about choosing the right approach for your specific data. And sometimes that might mean using a dot plot. Sometimes it might mean using a different tool.
This has been really eye-opening. I'm starting to see why dot plots are making a comeback. They're simple to understand, but they can reveal so much about your data. So before we move on, do you have any real-world examples of how dot plots were being used that you think would be helpful for our listeners?
Oh, absolutely. There are tons of great examples out there. Let's start with something everyone can relate to. Imagine you're a teacher, right? And you want to quickly see how your students did on a recent exam. A dot plot of their test scores would give you an instant snapshot of the results. You'd see the whole range, from the highest score to the lowest score, and where most of the scores clustered.
So instead of getting lost in a sea of grades, you'd have a clear picture of how the whole class did. And you could easily see which students might need some extra help or who really aced it. So really, anywhere you have data, a dot plot could be a useful tool. I'm starting to get that aha moment feeling now. I'm seeing how versatile they are.
It's exciting to see those connections click. And one of the best things about dot plots is that they're pretty straightforward to create. I mean, you can even do it with pen and paper if you have a small data set.
But I'm guessing there are also software tools and online resources that can make it even easier, especially for larger data sets.
Many spreadsheet programs have built-in charting tools that can create dot plots, and there are even websites specifically designed for creating them.
So even someone who's not a data expert can easily create and use these charts to understand their own data.
Exactly. It's all about empowering people to make sense of the information around them.
I love that. I'm curious to see a specific example in action. Do you have one that you find particularly interesting or that might resonate with our listeners?
Sure. Let's say you're a coffee enthusiast trying to find the perfect roast. You could create a dot plot with different coffee beans plotted according to their acidity level.
So instead of relying on those sometimes vague tasting notes, you'd have a visual representation of the data.
Precisely. You could immediately see which beans were low in acidity, which ones were high, and which ones fell in that sweet spot you're looking for.
That's a great example. And I could see applying that same concept to other things, like comparing the sweetness of different fruits or the spiciness of different peppers.
Absolutely. You got it. The possibilities are endless. And remember, you don't need a PhD in statistics to unlock these insights. Dot plots make data exploration accessible to everyone.
This has been really eye-opening. Before we wrap up, though, I think it's important to talk about some of the downsides or situations where a dot plot might not be the best tool for the job. Would you agree?
Definitely. Like any tool, dot plots have their limitations, and it's crucial to be aware of those. For sure. Like any tool, they have their place.
So what are some of the potential downsides that our listeners should keep in mind? When is a dot plot maybe not the best choice?
Well, one thing we got to remember is dot plots, they can get a bit crowded if you have too much data.
Too much data? Okay.
Think of it like trying to fit like all the stars in the Milky Way onto a single sheet of paper.
Okay, I'm starting to see the problem.
It'd be a mess, right? So they're not the best choice for those really massive data sets.
Right.
For those situations, other visualization tools like histograms or box plots, they might be a better fit.
Okay, that makes sense. I think we also talked a bit earlier about how comparing different groups on a single dot plot can get kind of messy too.
Yeah, definitely. If you're trying to compare like multiple groups, all those dots can overlap and it makes it really hard to see the differences between them.
It would be like trying to judge a chili cook-off, but all the samples got mixed together and it's just one big pot of chili.
Exactly. You wouldn't be able to tell which chili was which.
Right. You need those separate bowls to really appreciate the nuances of each recipe.
Exactly. In those cases, creating separate dot plots for each group or even just using a different type of visualization altogether would be more effective.
Okay, so dot plots are really great when you want to get a clear picture of a single data set. But when you want to do more complex comparisons, you're going to need a different approach.
Yeah, or like we were saying before, if you have huge amounts of data, you might need to switch to a different tool.
Right. It's all about finding that right tool for the job, like you said earlier.
Exactly. Now, we talked about data range earlier and how that can impact the effectiveness of a dot plot.
Yeah, you mentioned it can be a bit sensitive to the range of the data. Can you remind us why that is? Why does data range matter so much for dot plots?
Sure, yeah. So if your data is like spread out over a very wide range of values, the dot plot, it might look really sparse,
Right, like we were talking about before, with all those dots scattered across a vast expanse.
Exactly. And then on the flip side, if the range is very narrow, all the dots are going to bunch up together. And it makes it tough to see the individual data points.
So it's kind of a Goldilocks situation. You want that data range to be just right, not too wide, not too narrow.
Right, exactly. Like Goldilocks and the porridge.
So if the data range isn't ideal, if it's not in that sweet spot, are there things you can do to adjust the dot plot to make it work?
Oh yeah, definitely. There are options. One option is something called binning. Yeah, so binning is basically it's where you group data points together into smaller intervals.
Okay.
So instead of having a dot for every single value, you might group them into, ranges, kind of like we were talking about with the ages earlier.
Right. So if you were plotting ages, you might group people into like 5-year ranges.
Yeah, exactly. Instead of showing each individual age, and that can really help to create a more balanced visual representation.
So you're essentially condensing the data a bit, making it a little easier to digest visually.
Right, exactly. And then another option is scaling.
Okay, scaling.
So with scaling, you're adjusting the spacing on the number line to kind of accommodate the data range.
So you're basically stretching or compressing the axis to make the data fit better.
Exactly.
So there are things you can do, even if the data range isn't perfect, to kind of fine tune that dot plot and make it work for you.
Exactly. It's just about being aware of these potential issues and then choosing your approach, carefully.
I think the takeaway here is that dot plots are a really valuable tool, especially for those smaller to medium-sized data sets. When you need to see those patterns, spot those outliers, really get a feel for the shape of your data, they can be incredibly useful.
And don't forget how easy they are to create. You don't need to be a data expert to use them.
So to our listeners out there, we really encourage you to give dot plots a try. What kind of data do you come across in your everyday life? I mean, it could be anything, right?
Yeah. Your daily steps, your sleep patterns, the prices of your favorite groceries.
Exactly. Could a dot plot help you see that data in a new light? Maybe help you spot some interesting trends or outliers you weren't aware of? We encourage you to experiment with this tool and see what you can discover.
And if you find yourself working with a data set that's just too big, or maybe you're trying to make a comparison that's a bit too complex, remember there are other visualization tools out there. Yeah. It's all about, finding the right one for the task at hand.
Absolutely. The world of data visualization is vast and fascinating.
It's true. Dot plots aren't always like the perfect solution.
Right. We've been talking about all the good stuff, but yeah. I think it's only fair to address, some of those limitations.
For sure. So yeah, like any tool, dot plots, they have their downsides.
So what are some of the things that our listeners should keep in mind? What are some of the potential pitfalls of dot plots?
Well, one thing we've already touched on is that they can get a bit crowded if you have too much data.
Yeah, too much data.
Like think about, I don't know, like trying to track the stock prices of every company on the stock market.
Okay, yeah, that'd be a lot of dots.
A lot of dots, exactly. So for those really massive data sets, other visualization tools, they might be a better fit.
Right. Makes sense. Yeah. We also talked earlier about how comparing different groups on a single dot plot can get messy too.
Oh yeah, for sure. If you're trying to compare multiple groups, it can be tough to see the differences.
Like it's hard to untangle the different groups visually.
Right, exactly. The dots, they just all kind of blend together, and it's not as helpful.
So in those cases, you're better off creating like separate dot plots for each group.
Yeah, exactly. Or even just using a completely different type of visualization. Something that's more suited for comparisons.
So it sounds like dot plots are really good when you want to get a clear picture of a single data set.
Yes, exactly.
But if you want to do like complex comparisons, or you have, massive amounts of data, then you might need to consider a different approach.
Right, exactly. It's all about using the right tool for the job.
Now, you mentioned earlier that the range of the data can also impact the effectiveness of a dot plot.
Yeah, for sure.
So can you remind us why that is? Why does that matter so much?
Sure. So if your data is spread out over a very wide range of values, the dot plot, it might end up looking really sparse, like kind of empty.
Right, like those stars scattered across the galaxy, like we were talking about before.
Exactly. And then on the other hand, if the range is very narrow, then all those dots are gonna, cluster together, and it makes it hard to see the individual points.
Right. So you really want that data range to be just right.
Exactly. Not too wide, not too narrow, kind of that Goldilocks zone.
Well, I think the takeaway here is that dot plots can be a really valuable tool for for exploring data and for communicating insights,
Oh, absolutely.
especially for those smaller to medium-sized data sets. They help you see those patterns, they help you spot those outliers, and they're just really easy to understand.
Yeah, and to create.
Exactly. So to our listeners out there, we encourage you to give dot plots a try. Think about the data that you encounter in your everyday life. Could a dot plot help you see that data in a new way?
Yeah.
Maybe help you discover something interesting that you hadn't noticed before.
It's worth a shot.
It is. And if you find yourself working with a data set that's just too big, or you're trying to make a comparison that's just too complex for a dot plot, don't be afraid to explore other visualization tools. There's a whole world out there.
Exactly. And we can explore those in another deep dive.
Absolutely. But until then, happy plotting, everyone.